All right, so the next layer of this is what happens to TFC in a off season where Vancouver Whitecaps also searching for a new manager, and they're like, "Oh, for Christ's sakes, more competition now, right? Two good jobs, two really important jobs. There's some names available out there. We mentioned already, Jim Curtin obviously is an obvious one. Bobby Smirniotis, Tommy Wilton Jr. if they want to go the CPL route, which I think one of them should do personally.
Be very cool.
But let's start with this though, and maybe this will be our YouTube video. We'll see if it gets pointed. At this point, if you're a free agent coach or a coach looking to move up to the next level, is it Vancouver or is it Toronto? Jimmy?
Maybe Vancouver. I mean, look, I think it's a tough one for both. I'd imagine that the Whitecaps are probably going to try to get a European coach. I think TFC's got to be very specific in what they're looking for right now. Obviously, with everything that's happened, Herdman leaving, I'm sure a lot of the staff's going to be leaving now. It's been a mess over the last number of years, and they've got to be very accurate in the individual that they bring in. And I think that individual's got to have MLS experience. And I think this individual as well, I think he's got to have a very good, clean image that suits where the club is right now and what they need. They've got season tickets that they're about to sell, and Sinya's been an absolute disaster. Now all these allegations with Herdman resigns, it's not looking good for the club, and I think they've got to make sure that they get it 100% accurate. Now that's not saying that Bobby or Tommy aren't good enough for the job. I just think it's going to have to be, they're going to have to do their due diligence big time to make sure that they get the right individual that's going to come in and drive TFC forward. And again, with the Whitecaps, yes, I would like to see maybe a Bobby or Tommy, but I have a feeling that with the brass up top, I think they might go the European route.
Axel Schuster, obviously, a lot of connections overseas, right?
Yeah.
I think
Sharms, I did read. Sorry, I did read though. I think our friend Kula put it on our Twitter, and he just said the remaining staff of Vancouver of the Whitecaps has been retained. So it was one of those things that stood out for me because that's not a word. Stood out because in my experience, what you guys have always told me was it's kind of full on coaching changes, new staff. If a staff is already, if a club is already informing the new coach that this is a staff, how does that affect how you go forward in a hiring process? Jimmy, if someone said, "Hey, we want you at Vancouver, but these are the people you're going to be working with,"
that happens often as well, where a club will be happy with the supporting staff. They'll get a new manager to come in. Now, more than likely, that new manager will say, "Fine, I'll stay with this staff that you have, but I want to bring in at least my own assistant coach and maybe one other person to add to the staff." With TFC, I'd imagine that the coach that comes in, you'll probably be looking at all the Herdman staff that have been with him for a number of years, thinking, "Look, I want to bring in my own staff here. I want a clean slate." So I think it's two different situations with TFC and Vancouver at the moment.
I think the problem with the Toronto FC situation is Insigne. They're going to hope that somebody can get the best out of him, but I'm not sure that's going to happen. So if I was going to have the choice, I think I would be pushing toward Vancouver just because of that situation alone. It's been a disaster.
What's a better team to start with, right, Dubs?
And if you're Axel Schuster, I think in firing Vanni Sartini, you're doubling down on the roster that you've put together, right? As you're almost betting on yourself, and then you're just looking for the person who's going to take and elevate kind of what you've crafted. And I think they do have the pieces to do it. I think it's when you're looking at the two, if you're comparing Vancouver to Toronto as a coach, and maybe this is a question for you, Jimmy, is it an attractive sell for somebody who's looking to vault themselves into the upper echelons of coaching? Do you discount TFC because of the turmoil that they find themselves continually embroiled in?
It's a good question. I think Vancouver is probably the more likely job that some individuals would prefer to take at the moment, pending what's happening at TFC and what the situation is going to be with the staff, with Insigne, a few players, what their budget is. Is there some wiggle room where we can bring in a couple more players to make this squad stronger? Whatever coach is looking at either job, they're going to be doing their due diligence to find out exactly what they've got as soon as they get in there. Now, if you go to TFC and they say, we've got no money, but we're stuck with this squad. Or you could go to Vancouver and they say, yeah, we've got some money here that we can add a few more pieces. They got Armstrong that they brought towards the end of the season, who I think is another great asset. With Vancouver, I think that they're 1-2 pieces away from being a very, very good side and a contender, possibly. So maybe I think the appealing job at the moment would probably be the Whitecaps job.
But they're different jobs, right? Vancouver's looking for a manager to take them to the next level, right? They got to the playoffs. Yeah. Whereas TFC is looking for a guy to rebuild, right? In many ways, start from scratch if they can. And you're right, Craig. Insigne is still that hovering there, that big elephant in the room, or really small elephant in the room. but he's there. But at the same time,
more like a hawk.
At the same time, though, a new manager might look at him and say, man, I can be the guy. I can be the guy that can get the most out of him. He's still a great talent. I can find the solution. You see that all the time with troubled athletes and new gaffers coming in any sport saying, I'm going to be the Insigne whisperer. And I'm going to change it all. And he's going to lead us to a championship. Right? There is more cap space at TFC than last year. And that's the thing about the whole, what I'm sure John Herdman is so pissed off about after he gets over the anger towards Bev. It is like, it was never about the first year at TFC with John Herdman, right? It was about year 2 onwards when the cap space begins to open up a little bit more, to start building this team in his image. He never got that opportunity. And I still think TFC is a big job. They're going to also pay more for a coach, I think. It's still a big job, right? And the allure of being successful in this market is still just that, a real allure for a lot of coaches. I think Vancouver's the better job right now, for sure it is. It's a better team. You're closer to a championship, but don't dismiss what Toronto holds, I think, in the coaching ranks. It's funny, Jimmy, you were saying how they must get it right. It's a huge one, this. I remember you saying the exact same thing last year. when we were talking about getting Herdman, they had to get this. Bob Bradley was a disaster. It didn't work out. Prior to him, disaster. Since Greg Vanney, disaster. They had to get this one right. Oops.
Oops again.
Oops. Yeah.
What about if you compare Vancouver and Toronto? Like you mentioned Tommy and you mentioned Bobby. Both at the respective clubs, at Cavalry and at Forge, are also technical directors. So they're not just the head coaches. So when you're trying to attract like these big players in a coaching game, like who are forever riding that coaching carousel, does that matter? And is one more attractive than the other? Like, would you have more freedom potentially at TFC? Sharms, you mentioned maybe the upside of paying more in order to lure some of those candidates. Like, would a coach, if it's the right fit, if it's the right person, be given free reign, not necessarily like Bradley had, but where you have maybe more control over the club and perhaps the pathway and the academy and the players who are being recruited?
I think that was the biggest problem with the Bob Bradley situation, was he had total control of the club. Mm-hmm. And it's an awful lot to manage as a manager, is manage that first team and then look at the reserve team, then overlook the academy, doing contracts. It's way too much for one individual to do, especially the way that the game is today. So I think with TFC, if you're going to bring someone in, you're the manager, you're the head coach, and you just deal with this first team. And let other individuals within the organization deal with certain aspects to take a lot of that pressure off the coach, and so that he can just focus on his task, which is get results and manage this team.
And they are committed, it seems, to Jason Hernandez too, to figure this out, right? Very much so. As the GM, he's a pretty impressive guy, hear him speak, right? So he needs a chance to operate with some freaking money, which he didn't have last year as well. So, but I know what you're saying, Dubs. You know, those two guys, Bobby and Tommy, they come with so much more than just coaching chops. They've built teams from the ground up, literally built teams from the ground up. They know every facet of it. Jimmy says he wants to see what he thinks TFC want to have a guy with MLS experience. And I get that, Craig. But if not now, when for Bobby Simoniotis or Tommy Wilton Jr.? What more can they really do at the CPL level before they get a chance in MLS?
Well, that's exactly it. When do they get their chance? I would not hesitate to give either one of them a job in Major League Soccer. No hesitation whatsoever. They've learned an awful lot on and off the field over the last 5 or 6 years in CPL, and they've done a fantastic job. And they're classy guys. I think they wouldn't be out of place at all.
Yeah.
Plus, it would be a huge win for CPL. Sorry, Jimmy, a huge win for CPL.
Yeah.
A huge. I mean, you know, I was just watching Zagreb, that goal by Segar, and I was just thinking, you know, Canadians are moving up, and I know that he didn't play CPL, but just my point is developing.
Oh, Nico Seeger?
Yeah.
Okay, I was like, you were listening to Bob Seger? What's
Bob Seger,
happening?
yes.
I was like,
That's my line when we first signed him.
Like a rock.
yes.
Like a rock.
No, Hajduk Split beat Dinamo Zagreb yesterday 1-0 on Seger.
That's right. He had a
That's a
banger. They're talking about a time, a CPL time, after coming off that great final, having this momentum. One of those coaches need to be elevated domestically in the MLS or somewhere in the MLS to prove that, hey, this league is worth watching, worth investing in for marketing purposes, for advertising dollars, and for eyeballs, and to support fandom. And if it doesn't, then it just gets more, you know, like, hey, let's lift off for 2026. What better story would it be that, hey, a Canadian is the head coach of MLS that came out of the CPL? It's a great story.
Yeah, it is a great story. And don't get me wrong, it's not me saying Bobby and Tommy are good enough, because I believe that they are. I think they're very good. And I think they do need a shot at MLS club, and which I'm sure they will one day. I'm just saying with Toronto FC, I just think they're just in such a pickle right now. And the situation that they're in, I think they might want to lean towards a manager that understands MLS, understands the rules, knows the players, that can probably help Jason Hernandez and certain others within the organization collectively, that they can work together. But you never know. They might turn around and give it to Bobby. Bobby's a local guy, very good coach. He's a winner. So I could see him, you know, doing a great job in MLS, but I have no idea what TFC has in mind.
Well, don't forget, Jim Curtin had no coaching experience prior to Philadelphia. He was an assistant coach there for a couple of years, right? That was his first MLS gig. And then 10 years later, he leaves after, you know, bringing what? A philosophy, identity, culture, all the things that TFC are desperate for. And that
you pointed with your thumb. What were you doing when you pointed with your thumb back there?
Oh, it's more of a stamp. He's like,
okay.
Be out. It was an involuntary thumb extension.
Yeah, because it was like, I was like, who are you talking about back there? It was like, made me look.
Rather than cursing, I was using my fist to kind of really push my point across here. Which I thought
you were referring to Jimmy's, comment about TFC being in a pickle, and you were pointing to the pickle jars.
Oh, the pickle jars of the heads.
I love that you used that turn of phrase, Jimmy. It's just like... I know.
You did very well, Dubs, to contain yourself, because I saw you started to giggle a little bit there.
I know, I did.
But yeah, so Jim Curtin, brings all the things that Keith Pelly said this club hasn't got and needs, right? Makes a lot of sense. Now, so does Bobby Simoniotis, so does Tommy Wilton Jr. Bring all those things as well. Do you see it, though, a US team going for a Canadian coach who's plied their trade in the CPL, or is it a Canadian team or bust for these guys, Dubs?
I think where they have the most realistic shot is probably at one of these 3 Canadian MLS franchises. But it leaves me, I have no idea what the stats are, but if you look at the US and you look at their pretty robust USL system, I wonder if there's been a history of coaches who have seen success in USL being like Danny Dicchio. I mean, I know he's just new this year in Detroit, but is there, does that exist? Like, are coaches promoted if they have success, or and have like a dynasty like Bobby at Forge? do they see promotion into MLS? I don't know if there's any kind of track record. They are a precedent for it. But if I'm an MLS club, I'm looking at where coaches are making their mark. And I mean, you don't have to look further than north of the border. And I just don't know if it's on their radar, quite frankly. Like if you're in the south of the US, are you paying attention to CPL? Are you paying attention to dynasties like Forge or a team finally winning the CPL championship like Tommy and Cavalry? Like I just don't know if it's legitimately on the radar.
I think with the Canadian players now, they're attractive to a lot of people. A lot of the European clubs are interested in the Canadian market now. Same with MLS. And we've seen CPL players make that jump into MLS or make that jump from CPL into USL. And now we just need to get the coaches going. And Bobby and Tommy are the next two that need to make that jump. And if they make that jump, then they're going to create a pathway, just like all these players have done today. And making a name for Canadian footballers and hopefully Canadian coaches as well, where people will eventually turn and look across the border and say, yeah, we're going to take this next manager because he deserves a shot and he knows what he's doing. He's very good at what he does, and we're gonna go for him.
But does it need to go via USL, as Dubs mentioned there? Do you think, Jimmy, is that sadly the reality for a Bobby or a Tommy, that if they want to make that jump to MLS, it might have to go via somewhere else first?
I don't think so. I don't think why wouldn't an MLS team down in the States go for one of these coaches as opposed to going for a Colombian or an Argentinian because it sounds sexy. Well, I think it's the tides are changing now, and Canadian coaches, they know what they're doing. They're very good, and we've seen it with the players now. So I think now's the time.
I mean, a guy like Danny Dichio, I mean, he moved away from Toronto SC for reasons that he didn't want to be a mascot anymore, and he wanted to move up the coaching ranks at Toronto SC. That clearly wasn't going to happen unless he moved away. So he moved to California, Sacramento, and then over to Detroit, where he's done really well. It's gone really well. And Nick Dazovich's assistant speaks very highly of him and what he does and his leadership qualities that he brings. And Danny Dichio is another one that's got to be on that list as far as looking for a big job.
He'd be a big mascot, wouldn't he?
He'd be a massive mascot. Be like that boiler.
A surly one at that.
Yeah. You know when people attack mascots, I'd hate for them.
Yeah, you'd be the mascot that would break the code and take the head off and scare all the kids, right? Start beating people up.
Meet you out in the parking lot.
But just to remind the audience here, and listen, it was a previous leadership group at TFC. Okay, I understand that, but still, Danny Dichio, who had been there from day one, had made his move through the academy, very respected, wasn't even afforded an interview for that job, head coach job, when it came up. Not even a fucking interview. I mean, yeah, I think it's disgusting. Quite honestly.
It's funny that we have sour grapes for Deech.
I know.
That's a bit of an indictment, though, right? On the people who are in place and the ownership and leadership. That, and to Jimmy's point about a Colombian or a Mexican or somebody of a different nationality being that sexier candidate because they've plied their trade elsewhere. So like people who are doing it in our own country, we're overlooking, and that's shitty, right? That we need to start changing that.
Well, yeah. I found like it was a pretty intensely American franchise at that point too. Very looking down south. I mean, the hire of Chris Armas, there's a lot of question marks where they're not even people weren't even being given interviews. It was quite run. It seemed like it was, hey, here's our forte is looking at down south for talent. That's what it looked like.
Well, I mean, it worked with Greg Vanney, in fairness, right? It worked pretty well. But You're right. I mean, again, let's not hammer a previous regime. Hopefully it's changed now. We'll see. There's an opportunity now, isn't there, to show that. And they got to get a move on here as well, right? This is the off season for MLS. They want to start attracting players. January's around the corner with a lot of European players, perhaps, maybe becoming available. Now's the time, right, to get your house in order. So get a move on, and I'm sure they realize that. So if Keith Pelly thought he was arriving at MLSC and we'll put TFC on the back burner, we'll worry about the Leafs and the Raptors, whatever else. I think he's realizes now he's not going to be that way. this is a house that's burning right now, and they got to figure something out pretty quickly because there's such fan apathy towards TFC right now. It's like, like, even less anger, right? It's like, oh, ho hum. Once again, they're in a mess. Kind of used to this, you know. Anyway, we'll see what happens in the next few weeks.